Hi, I'm George Kilpatrick, and welcome to CI After the Show. And the conversation continues with the conversation about Michael Jackson. Joining me now is Bob Thompson. He's the director for the Bleier Center for the Study of TV and Popular Culture. And also joining us from CNY Speaks, Greg Munno, who is hanging out with us as well. And Bob, let's talk about this. I found it interesting that you said that Thriller was a metaphor for his life, the video Thriller, that he sort of he starts out as one thing and then turns into something that we don't recognize.
Yeah, I mean, I think he didn't start, he started out pretty much out of the womb, destined to become this, star. But he became so famous. I mean, there is a point where you become such a big celebrity that celebrity, in fact, becomes a terminal disease. I mean, everywhere he went, he got followed, looked at. To get any kind of privacy was impossible, so that he had to. And I'm not saying he was a victim. He created his own stardom. He wanted to be famous, but once he got it, he had to disappear. He was exiled to Planet Michael, and it was called Neverland. Talk about an appropriately named house. I mean. And I think a lot of the problems that he had later, all that stuff with the kids, which I really think he believed he wasn't doing anything wrong. Whenever he would come out to defend himself, I think he was so out of it. He had become so completely separate from the rest of the world. And celebrity really made that absolutely necessary.
Culturally, how does Michael Jackson fit in? I mean, you saw the big tribute in Harlem, for example. So the black community sort of embraced him, accepted him, even as he sort of bleached his skin and went in a whole other direction. That's kind of weird, isn't it?
And this is fascinating, because Michael Jackson, every way you normally define someone, his lines were blurred. Gender. He was a man, but he had that high voice, and he made
and later with the long hair,
and the long hair. So gender, race. He was an African American, but his skin kept changing colors. Age. He was technically an adult, from in the 80s on, but he behaved like a child. He talked like one, and he had all these kids that he hung around, and he liked having overnights and all the rest of it. Anytime you kind of got to get a bead on this guy, it was blurry. But the race thing is interesting. He always talked about how he wanted to take over Elvis. He wanted to steal Elvis's thorny crown and become the king of pop music. And to an extent, he accomplished that. And what's interesting is
right, because Elvis was the king, right?
Right, Elvis was the king of rock and roll. Michael became the king of pop, whatever. But what's interesting is that Elvis, of course, took a African American music tradition, the rock and roll and all of its various things, and mainstreamed it, became its delivery system, because he was doing it in the form of a white performer, which at the time was considered, you could sell it better, and we've all heard those stories. So if Elvis kind of hijacks an African-American music tradition and puts it in a white package, Michael, to some extent, got it back. He sort of reclaimed that Elvis tradition for, the musical tradition that he, of course, had been born into and come out of and all the rest of it. And that all gets more complicated, because even though and I think that's why Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and all of these other people are so anxious to claim this legacy and to make sure it's framed right, because Michael Jackson becomes an important part of African American cultural history and a hero in some ways. But then when you start talking about race, what's the deal with the skin, and what's the deal with all of this other kind of stuff? And then once again, it leads you where every conversation about Michael Jackson leads, which is to total confusion. Yeah. A very, very complicated guy.
Now, Greg, you're really surprised at how big this has become around the world.
A little bit, because I had already kind of put Michael Jackson on the shelf.
Yeah.
And I thought other people had too. I mean, he was the king of pop. He was the biggest star. No one's really touched him in terms of that popularity, even Madonna, I don't think. And then he just became, for lack of a better phrase, a tabloid freak. And and even that seemed to kind of wear thin after a while. His celebrity never changed. I'm sure he would still attract a crowd wherever he went, but he wasn't the hottest thing even in the tabloid world, and it was kind of like, oh, that's already been done and past. Now, for real hardcore fans of his, which I was not, I think these upcoming London concerts were something that they were really getting excited about, and he was re-entering kind of people's consciousness right at the time that he ended up dying. But I'm amazed at the outpouring of sentiment and the enthusiasm for him.
The willingness to suspend that other part of his life that is the most talked about, or at least from the tabloid standpoint. Bob, you said earlier you don't think that these allegations and the nature of the relationship with the children will be as big a deal 100 years from now.
In 100 years. I think for as long as people are alive that were alive at Michael Jackson's time, however, they will be. After that, one of your producers pointed out during our break that many great artists have had lifestyles that were really
Could you talk about some of them? Who, like?
Well, she had pointed out Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, and depending on what biographies you read, and we have to remember with Michael Jackson too, he was acquitted of that.
Right.
Certainly testimony came out during those court cases that were highly disturbing.
Yeah.
No question about that. But he was actually never convicted of any of those things. We do have to keep that in mind.
But his own words, I mean, but I don't want to go down that road, but even his own words, a lot of people are willing to see him as that childlike person, even as a man, talking about innocent, oh, it's just me being innocent, and some people are willing to forgive that.
Yeah, well, and I think it was because he died. And you make a really good point, because I agree with you. It had gotten to the point where we were no longer looking forward to his next musical release. We were looking forward to the next bizarre thing he would do. And he generally didn't let us down. You didn't have to wait too long, and he'd dangle a child or he'd do whatever. And I think he was on the verge, if not already, kind of a parody. In Living Color did the Mr. Potato Head Michael Jackson with the different noses you could put on and everything. And that was way back in the 90s or whatever. The fact that this spectacular final curtain, though, you know, it's easier to forgive something for all kinds of things when they're dead. I mean, he got the ultimate, whatever. And I think that's why in the beginning there was mostly this outpouring of affection. Whenever anyone dies suddenly, you feel sorry for them.
You think this is going off the front pages then soon?
Oh, I think very soon. September 11th, by day 6, the late-night comedies were coming back, the commercials were back. That was the biggest disaster story of the
I think this will be going on for a long time.
Only as each new thing comes, as somebody sues something. Because unlike O.J., that story kept having information. The fact is, this story begins when the story ends.
Yeah,
and
even at death, he's continuing to be controversial because who owns what, who gets to do what, that you're going to say, Greg? You going to say something?
I think that people will follow new developments in the case because his biography, in a sense, is still being written, and a lot of important chapters I think will be filled in now. But I think the kind of outpouring of emotion and thought. Another thing is his music, I think, is linked to a lot of big moments in people's lives and a lot of fun moments. I think, at any point in time, a year ago, 10 years ago, you're in a disco, quarter of the people are dancing, three-quarters of the people are not, a Michael Jackson song comes on, everybody gets up. Yeah. And there's just this...
You want to be starting something, right?
There's just this... I think I think the celebrities who really end up having kind of a personal meaning for people are the ones that the personal meaning that someone has, they can attribute to that person's music or that person's art. And so I think that that's really part of that kind of, and so that will never go away. People will always benchmark part of their lives on Michael Jackson.